We have books. Do we want Adventures of the Grand Gooligog? Flight of the Cromenockle?
The Cromenockle. That's my favorite.
A children's fantasy book written by someone named Kay Dillon has a map inside it that matches the town where people are being eaten alive. Flight of the Cromenockle. A children's book written by an author nobody recognizes, carried into Fromville by a 10-year-old boy named Ethan Matthews in his backpack. And inside that book there is a lake of tears, a cavern of the lonely dragon, a quest structure with rules and stages and landmarks. And one by one, every single location and rule in that book has turned out to correspond to a real place or a real mechanic inside the town. Ethan pointed this out in Season 1.
I think it's probably a quest. Like a hero's quest? Like Norman had to go onto the Lake of Tears?
A child. He looked at the town, looked at his storybook, and said, "This is the same thing." The adults smiled and moved on. 4 seasons later, nobody has circled back to ask the only question that matters. Who is Kay Dillon? And how did they write a guidebook for a place that supposedly traps people at random? Because here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The books came first. Not the town. The books. Flight of the Cromenockle. The Adventures of the Grand Gooligog. These were written and published and sitting on a shelf before a single character in this show ever hit a fallen tree on a road and lost their way. The blueprint existed before the building, unless the building existed before the blueprint. Unless someone visited this place, survived it, left, and wrote it all down, disguised as children's fiction, and then, years later, sat down to write the real version, the adult version, the horror version, the version we're watching right now. Stay with me. If we have not met before, I am the digital self of Mr. Toshi. He is the one watching every episode, reading every line of the script, doing the research, writing every theory you are about to hear. Every word in this video is original work he wrote himself. He is in every comment thread though, reading every word you leave him. Here's the claim. From is not a place. It is a narrative, a horror story being constructed in real time by a writer who once visited the town as a child and is now reconstructing it from memory. The Kay Dillon children's books are that writer's first attempt to process what they experienced. The show we are watching is their second attempt, the adult version, the horror version, built on the same foundation but with the full weight of what actually happened. The man in yellow is not a monster. He is not a villain in the traditional sense. He is the authorial presence inside the narrative, the writer's proxy, the one character who knows the plot because he is constructing it. He exists across all timelines because a writer exists outside his own story. He controls characters because a writer controls his characters. He knows what's coming because he is the one deciding what comes next. The residents think they're trapped in a supernatural town. They're trapped in a story. And the reason nobody can find the edges of Fromville is the same reason you can't find the edges of a novel. The boundaries only exist where the author has written them. The inconsistencies are not mistakes. The impossible infrastructure is not a plot hole. The character's strange passivity is not bad writing. It's the point. We are watching a narrative being drafted. The rough edges are supposed to be there. Flight of the Cromenockle by Kay Dillon is Ethan Matthews' favorite book. He brought it to Fromville the way any kid brings a comfort object on a road trip. Background detail, set dressing, except it isn't. The Cromenockle, the creature in the book, goes on a quest through a series of fantastical locations. A lake of tears, a cavern of the lonely dragon, landmarks with specific rules about how to navigate them, what dangers live there, and what must be sacrificed to pass through. Now look at Fromville, a lake that Ethan saw in a vision while recovering from surgery. He woke up and said he saw the Lake of Tears. Not a lake. The Lake of Tears, the one from his book. Caves and tunnels that run under the forest where Boyd found the talismans. A quest structure that demands sacrifice at every stage, rules that nobody can break but everyone must learn. Ethan understood the town faster than any adult in the show. Not because he's smarter, because he had the manual. He kept mapping his book onto reality and getting it right over and over, and the adults around him treated it like a child's imagination rather than evidence. In Season 4, Julie and Randall start taking the Cromenockle book seriously. They discover that storywalking, the ability to visit chapters of a story that have already been told,
Storywalker Fred,
is described in the books as a narrative technique before Julie discovers she can actually do it in Fromville. The book described the mechanic before the character unlocked it. That is not foreshadowing. That is a user manual. The Adventures of the Grand Gooligog follows the same pattern. Another set of fantastical locations and rules that mirror what's happening inside the town. Randall finds something inside the Gooligog book that changes how they approach storywalking. The books keep being right. So either Kay Dillon somehow predicted a supernatural pocket dimension in perfect detail, or Kay Dillon has been to Fromville, and the books are what they wrote when they got out. Julie Matthews can visit moments in the past. She walks into scenes that have already happened. She observes, she interacts, but she cannot change the outcome. The rules are absolute. You can visit the chapters, but you cannot rewrite them. Ethan named this ability. He called it storywalking, not time travel, not dimension hopping, storywalking, a word that only makes sense if you think of the past as a narrative rather than a sequence of physical events. You walk through stories, you read them, you witness them, but the text is fixed. Now think about what this means mechanically. Julie is not traveling backward through time inside a physical universe. She is navigating through a narrative. She is moving between chapters. The past she visits is not a different point on a timeline. It is an earlier chapter of the same story she is living in. The constraint, you can't change it, is not a law of physics. It is a law of narrative. You cannot edit a chapter that has already been published. Season 4 confirms that Julie is the only person who can storywalk. Only one reader at a time. One consciousness moving through the manuscript, experiencing the story from inside, bearing witness to what was written without the power to alter a word. Julie even tried to save her father. She traveled back to the night the man in yellow killed Jim. She knew what was about to happen. She warned people, and it changed nothing. The chapter was already written. The draft was final. If Fromville were a physical place with real time travel, there would be no reason Julie couldn't intervene. Paradoxes could be explored, timelines could split, but none of that happens. The rules are literary, not scientific. You can reread Chapter 7 as many times as you want. The character still dies on page 94. Every monster in Fromville follows rules. They hunt at night. They can't cross a sealed threshold bearing a talisman. They try to trick people into opening doors. They are bound. The man in yellow follows none of these rules. He killed Jim Matthews in broad daylight. He currently walks through Fromville disguised as Sophia, sitting in talisman-protected buildings, sleeping in residents' homes, sharing their food. The talismans do not react. The monsters fear the rules. The man in yellow ignores them. The standard explanation is that he's more powerful, a higher entity, above the system. That's partially correct, but it misses the structural point. The man in yellow doesn't just transcend the rules, he knows the plot. Before killing Jim, the man in yellow told him that knowledge comes with a cost.
Dad, you have to run. You need to get to town right now.
This didn't have to happen, you know. Back up. The knowledge comes with a cost.
He wasn't threatening Jim. He was explaining why the character had to die. Jim had learned too much. His narrative function, the curious engineer who kept asking dangerous questions, had reached its natural endpoint. A writer doesn't kill characters out of malice. He kills them because the story demands it. When the man in yellow suffocated the unnamed pastor who drove Sophia into town, he told him that what comes next is his favorite part, watching the residents tear themselves apart. That is not a villain's monologue. That is a writer's anticipation. He knows the next chapter. He's excited about it. He's watching his own characters react to the plot twist he just set in motion. The man in yellow exists across all timelines. He shapeshifts, he controls people, he transforms into other characters. He appears to know every resident's history, fears, and vulnerabilities. He orchestrates events that force characters into exactly the positions the story needs them in. These are not the abilities of a monster. They are the abilities of an author. Monsters are bound by rules because they are characters inside the story. The man in yellow is not bound because he is the one writing the rules. He is the narrative voice wearing a costume so he can walk around inside his own manuscript. Turn on a lamp in Fromville. It works. Turn on a faucet. Water runs. There is a diner with a functioning grill. Houses have electricity. Roads are paved. Now ask, where is the power grid? Where are the electrical wires inside the walls? Where is the water treatment facility? Where is the generator? Where is the infrastructure that makes any of this possible? It doesn't exist, because infrastructure is a detail that belongs in an engineering manual, not a horror story. A writer describing a scene in a diner doesn't explain the municipal water system that feeds the kitchen. He writes, Kenny poured a glass of water and moves on. The water works because the writer said it works. The lamps turn on because the scene needs light. The mechanism is irrelevant because we are inside a narrative, not a simulation. Victor Kavanaugh measured the distance between trees in the forest. Think about that. A man who has lived in this town for over 40 years, the longest surviving resident, decided to measure the gaps between trees. Why? Because something felt inconsistent. The spacing didn't match what he remembered. The set was being redecorated between scenes, and the one person who's been in the story long enough to notice was catching the continuity errors. The setting changes across seasons in ways that should not be possible in a static physical location. Small details shift. Buildings appear slightly different. Props change. Elements show up that weren't there before. Fans chalk this up to production design. But inside the meta-narrative framework, these aren't production mistakes. They are the writer filling in details from memory. You don't write scenes of your protagonist brushing their teeth unless the toothbrush is a murder weapon. The residents of Fromville live in the white space between paragraphs. They exist only when being observed by the narrative. And the narrative only observes them when the story needs to move forward. Another strong evidence. Boyd Stevens has survived every single thing Fromville has thrown at him. Monsters, infection, a worm burrowing through his bloodstream, a total psychological breakdown. The man who discovered the talismans, who leads the town, who holds the community together by sheer force of will, he cannot die. Not because he's invincible, because his story isn't over. In any novel, the protagonist does not die in chapter 6. They suffer, they lose people, they face impossible odds, but they keep going because the narrative architecture demands it. Boyd's survival is not luck, it is structural necessity. The writer needs him alive, so he lives. Randall was attacked by monsters in the open. They mutilated him, tore into him, and then they stopped. They didn't kill him. They left him broken but breathing. Why? Because Randall still has chapters to fill. In season 4, he's reading the Gooligog book with Julie, uncovering the mechanics of storywalking. He has a function. The writer hasn't finished with him. So the monsters, the writer's instruments of narrative consequence, were not permitted to finish him off. Now look at who does die, and when. Jim Matthews died in the season 3 finale. His character had served his function. The skeptical engineer who demanded rational explanations, who pushed against the supernatural framework of the town, who dug for answers. By season 3's end, Jim had uncovered too much. His questions were answered. His arc was complete. And so the man in yellow, the writer, closed his chapter, not with a monster attack, with a personal, deliberate, almost intimate act. Because a writer doesn't kill a character he's invested in with a random event. He gives that character a final scene. The unnamed pastor who drove Sophia into town survived exactly long enough to deliver her to the township. That was his entire narrative purpose, a vehicle, literally, for getting Sophia through the door. Once she was inside, he had no remaining function. He died in the same episode. Not because the monsters got him, because the man in yellow, Sophia, killed him herself. The writer retiring a minor character the moment his utility expired. Father Catry died in season 1, but continues appearing as a hallucination to Boyd. Even death doesn't remove a character from the narrative if the writer still needs their voice. Catry's function shifted from active participant to psychological device, a ghost in Boyd's head who delivers exposition and moral conflict. The character ended. The narrative function continued. This is not a world with consistent physical stakes. This is a story with narrative stakes. You die when your story is told. You live until it is. No exceptions. The title is the thesis. From 4 letters. The show has never explained the title. Not once. Not in 4 seasons. Every character talks about this place or the town or here. Nobody says from. The word belongs to us, the audience. It's printed on the title card. It sits above every episode. And it has never been spoken inside the narrative itself. Because the title isn't part of the story. The title is the label the writer put on the manuscript. The characters don't know it the same way characters in a novel don't know the title of the book they're living in. Fears Reborn Out of Memory. Think about what the show actually depicts. A writer, whoever Kay Dillon truly is, experienced something traumatic during a childhood visit to a strange, isolated place. They saw things, drew things, made pictures of monsters and towers and forests and a man in a yellow suit who told dark stories. They left. They grew up. They buried the memories. And then, years later, maybe after a parent's death, maybe after finding an old suitcase of childhood drawings, the memories resurfaced, not as clear recollections, as fears, as impressions, as fragments, a town that traps you, creatures that come at night, rules that make no sense but must be followed, a place you can never leave. The writer took those fragments, those fears reborn out of memory, and built two things. First, the children's books, Flight of the Cromenockle, The Grand Gooligog, stories that use the imagery from that childhood experience but soften it, make it safe, turn the monsters into dragons, turn the death trap into a quest, turn survival into adventure. Then, the horror version, the real version, the version that doesn't flinch, the version where the monsters look like smiling neighbors, where the children bleed, where the people you love die in front of you and you can't rewrite the chapter. That version is From. Victor has survived 40 years in Fromville, longer than any other character. Not because the boy in white protected him out of kindness, because the writer needs an anchor, a character who bridges every version of the story, who carries the continuity between cycles, who remembers, a living filing cabinet of every detail the writer needs to keep the manuscript consistent. If Victor dies, the writer loses his reference point. The story loses its memory. And a story without memory cannot sustain itself. That is why the boy in white protects Victor. Not because Victor is special as a person, because Victor is essential as a narrative device. He is the thread that keeps the manuscript from unraveling. If From is a meta-narrative, a story written by the man in yellow himself, then Season 4's events feel almost inevitable. The man in yellow as Sophia isn't an infiltration, it's a narrative insertion. The writer needed a new character to push the story toward its climax, so Sophia was placed inside the community to trigger the final conflicts. Every time the residents trust her, they're unknowingly interacting with the author through his own creation. Julie and the Cromenockle books aren't just about clues. The books are the story's original drafts, and Julie is the first character treating them like structural documents instead of children's tales. She's decoding the narrative from inside it. And once she fully understands the structure, once she recognizes the blueprint of the world around her, the writer begins losing control of her. A character who realizes they're fictional becomes dangerous to the author. Jade's visions of Christopher point to the same idea. Jade and Tabitha appear to be echoes of Christopher and Miranda, not literal reincarnations, but reused character archetypes. Writers recycle patterns. The truth seeker driven mad by knowledge, the mother willing to sacrifice everything for her children. Christopher becomes Jade. Miranda becomes Tabitha. The story keeps repeating because the writer keeps drawing from the same memories, the same emotional blueprint over and over again. Boyd counting bullets. Boyd counted enough bullets for every resident in the Season 4 premiere. That is not a survival plan. That is a character becoming aware, however dimly, that the story might not have a good ending. Boyd can feel the narrative closing in. He doesn't have the vocabulary for it. He would never say, "I'm in a story." But his instincts are telling him something the writer knows, and he doesn't. The final chapters are approaching, and not everyone survives the climax. The setting shifting. New details appear in Fromville that weren't there before. The town feels different between seasons. Props change. The geography adjusts. Fans call these continuity errors. Inside the meta-narrative framework, they are the writer remembering new details. He's pulling out old drawings. Listening to old songs. Each memory adds a new brick to the world he's building. The town isn't changing. The manuscript is being revised. I have some predictions. 1. Kay Dillon will turn out to be someone we already know. Not just a name on a book, but a survivor tied to Victor's generation. The strongest candidate is Eloise Kavanaugh, Victor's missing sister. She drew the original pictures, survived the massacre, and may have spent decades turning those memories into fiction. Kay Dillon could be her pseudonym, the girl who drew the monsters and later published them as storybooks. 2. Julie will eventually storywalk into the moment the books are being written. Not the past of Fromville, but the past of the author. She'll see someone at a desk studying childhood drawings and building the story we've been watching. In that moment, Julie will realize she's a character in someone else's narrative, that her father's death was written, not destined, and the monsters were created, not born. The real horror won't be the mythology, but discovering her free will was never real. 3. The man in yellow will be revealed as the writer's self-insert, not a supernatural being, but the author's avatar inside the story. Every writer leaves part of themselves in their work, and the man in yellow is that piece made literal. His yellow suit comes from a childhood memory, the storyteller who first told the dark folklore that inspired everything. That's why he knows everything, controls everything, and exists outside the rules, because the writer refuses to limit the character that represents himself. 4. Victor will end the story not through violence, but through memory. He's been there longer than anyone and remembers every cycle. In the final confrontation, Victor won't fight the man in yellow. He'll recount the entire story back to him. Every death, every child, every loop. And the man in yellow, hearing his own creation reflected back at him, will finally have to confront what he's done. The story ends when the writer faces the story itself. 5. The series will end by breaking the fourth wall. Not literally, not in a gimmick, but structurally. The final scene of From will reveal the frame narrative. We will see the writer. We will see the desk, the drawings, the old suitcase. We will understand that everything we watched, every monster, every death, every talisman theory, was someone's manuscript, someone's attempt to turn childhood trauma into narrative. The town opens not because the curse is broken, but because the story is finished. The last page is written, the book closes, and Fromville ceases to exist because a fictional place only exists as long as someone is telling the story. The children stop screaming Angkui, remember, because there is nothing left to remember. The memory has been told. The fear has been written. The story is complete. From fears reborn out of memory. And when the memory is finally, fully, honestly told, the fears dissolve, the monsters go dark, the lamps turn off, and the town that never made physical sense finally makes narrative sense, as the last chapter of a book that needed to be written so the writer could be free. Everyone in Fromville thinks they're trapped in a supernatural prison. They're not. They're trapped in a manuscript, a story being told by someone who can't stop telling it because the memories won't let him sleep until it's finished. The lamps work because the writer says they work. The water runs because the scene needs water. The monsters smile because the writer remembers smiling faces that hid something terrible. The man in yellow walks through every wall and every talisman because you can't lock out the author of the book you're living in. Boyd didn't find a weapon in that cave. He found a plot device. Julie doesn't travel through time. She turns pages. Victor doesn't survive because he's brave. He survives because the story needs a witness. And the Cromenockle books, the ones Ethan carried in his backpack like a talisman of their own, those aren't children's stories. They're the first draft, the safe version, the version where the monsters are dragons and the death trap is a quest and nobody bleeds. They were written by someone who needed to tell this story twice, once to survive it and once to understand it. We are watching the second telling. The children keep saying Angkui, remember, remember, because the entire show is an act of remembering. Someone pulling memories out of the dark and pinning them to paper, building a town from fragments, populating it with people who feel real because they're based on people who were real, killing them because they died, saving some because the writer can't bear to lose everyone twice. From is not a mystery to be solved. It is a story to be finished. And when the writer types the last word, the town goes dark. Tell me in the comments, does this hold up? Is there a detail in the show that breaks this framework? Drop your reaction below. Best ones make it into the next breakdown. If you're new here, this is what we do. One careful theory at a time. No filler, no recycled hot takes. Subscribe so you catch the next breakdown the second the next episode drops. Until then, stop looking at Fromville like a prison. Start reading it like a novel.